it's still time to stop.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres calling for a ceasefire as the battle for Tripoli rages on. Rival forces are locked in a fierce fight for control of the capital. Is Libya on the verge of a full-blown civil war? Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. The situation in Libya remains tense after days of fighting between UN-backed forces and troops loyal to General Khalifa Haftar. Despite calls from the international community to end the violence, Haftar's troops aren't backing down. Thousands have been displaced and dozens reported killed in the conflict as Libya spirals further into chaos. There's a lot to unpack here, and let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from London is Emad Badi. He is a counter-terrorism and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Also in London, we are joined by Anas al-GomatI. He is director of the Sadeq Institute, Libya's first think tank. Well, welcome both of you for joining the show. Can I start with you, Emad? First of all, who is Haftar and why is this happening now?
Well, in terms of who Haftar is in particular, we have to take a look back at Libya's history. Haftar was a commander that took part in Gaddafi's coup in 1969 and then lost the battle in Chad, was captured and then employed by the CIA, allegedly. For a while, he returned then in 2011 and then launched his Operation Dignity 2014. Slightly before that, actually, before officially launching his Operation Dignity, he attempted to put up a coup against the government. And this particular offensive, despite the fact that this word hasn't been used a lot to describe it this way, it is actually still a coup against the UN-backed government. It's an attempt to establish a new military reality that would translate into a new political one, whereby the government of national accord would lose its legitimacy based on being militarily defeated.
Anas al-GomatI, I want to get your reaction to his rise as well, but let's just hear from the man himself first.
Heroes, the time has come. It is time to advance, as you have always done, with a firm step towards Tripoli and to enter it peacefully.
Anas al-GomatI, his assault on Tripoli and the surrounding area coincided essentially with the visit of the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, meant to be planning for a peace conference. Why now and what's behind it all?
Well, it's a history. I mean, it's, as Emad actually rightly pointed out, it's actually 50 years this year of Haftar's legacy as a veteran in deception and defection. 1969, he defected from the king to Gaddafi. 1986, he defected from Gaddafi to Hussein Hibri. 1987, he defected to the CIA and then to the National Front Salvation of Libya, Libya's first opposition. He then defected again in 1992 to the Reform and Change movement led by Briggs Swissi. He then defected back to Gaddafi in 2004, and then against Gaddafi in 2011, and then against the first elected parliament in Libya in 2014. And then he defected to the Emiratis, and then he defected in 2019 against the UN-backed plan that he'd signed onto only a month earlier in the United Arab Emirates. So it's 50 years this year from 1969 to 2019, and that just sort of tells you a little bit about how some people have a problem with changing their stripes and going against their inherent nature. That really has been Haftar's history. He's only ever got that kind of legacy at heart, and I think it's dangerous to assume that this is a kind of person that not only has kind of any form of altruistic or grievance-based operations in mind. This is someone that had launched the counter-terrorism movement at the very moment where people in the east of the country, in Benghazi, had been facing 2 years of assassinations at the time and had really faced an extremism problem. 5 years after that invasion, there are still assassination problems that are happening in Benghazi. He launched an invasion in Libya's south to go and fight quote-unquote terrorist movements, but he used that as a staging platform only a month later. Now the south of Libya has only had 3 days ago an ISIS terrorist attack. All of the groups that were deployed to the south of the country to go and fight against terrorism, they're fighting a very unnecessary war in the north of Libya. I think what he was doing with Antonio Guterres' visit was demonstrating not only to the international community that they were foolish to try to force him into a political agreement that would essentially be endorsed by elections. Libyans would have a choice. You can elect whatever civilian face that you may like as a president, but you don't have a choice over who leads your army, and that will be Khalifa Haftar. And Khalifa Haftar, that still wasn't good enough for him, and as Emad rightly pointed out, he wanted to change the military facts on the ground and make a naked grab for power in Tripoli. And I think that's really just going back to the legacy as explained, half a century, and some people still haven't learned their lesson.
Emad, you can detect Anas's skepticism there of Haftar and his motives, but he has been quite successful in the east of Libya in terms of driving out more Islamist tendencies, the incursion into the south, uniting some of the various militias in the east of Libya, and of course a lot of those areas have a lot of oil, and it's rumored that he has a lot of foreign backers too, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Well, it depends. I mean, obviously, it depends what you mean by success to a certain extent,
right?
Because you have to look at the price that was paid to achieve this as well. Benghazi is completely, I mean, swaths of Benghazi are completely destroyed. Derna, where he also launched an operation, was completely destroyed. And I think the price to pay is often not proportional to the actual success achieved, especially considering the fact that most of the money that the central bank in the east has went to the effort, so-called effort of war against terrorist groups, etc. Now, there's a problem of narrative here, whereby Haftar always uses any military fait accompli of Haftar is used or is conducted under the labels of security provision or counter-terrorism. It's very difficult to use the same narrative when it comes to Tripoli, because until a few months ago, Haftar was still negotiating with armed groups in Tripoli in order to co-opt them and integrate them into his army structure. So to call them now terrorists a month later is a bit deceptive. Now, the self-fulfilling part of that, the self-fulfilling prophecy sort of how that narrative operates is that when he uses this wide labeling process, a lot of armed groups that are opposed to him and terrorist groups will join armed groups that he has previously sought to integrate into his own army. So, yeah.
Okay. Anas, I want to get to the international community in a minute, but I wanted you to pick up on the sort of foreign influence on Haftar, because there's been rumors that he's supported by the Egyptian leader, al-Sisi, the United Arab Emirates, even Saudi Arabia, we're hearing in news reports here in Washington today, and of course, European powers too. France has been a bit of a question mark. Is that where we are, Anas?
Yes, I mean, I think the deception really starts from the international perspective, because all those countries that you've just mentioned have all supported the internationally recognized government in Libya, or at least they've paid lip service towards doing so. And the moment that that government was attacked, we began to realize that, in fact, it was the UN's inability, and Antonio Guterres was in Tripoli, it was their inability to name and condemn and shame Haftar or penalize him or even threaten sanctions. And that blockage was coming from the French in the P5, that came again from the French in the European Union, according to Italian diplomats, came again in the G7 statement, and it came again in the P3+3 configuration. Now, that's just diplomatically. The UAE has, in fact, over the last couple of years, especially at the moment where in 2016 we went through a 2.5-year negotiation, dialogue, and peace process, delivered a government into Tripoli, and it was the year the UAE ramped up in unprecedented levels their arms embargo violations to Libya, but also established the first overseas base in their history in eastern Libya. They've used that base as a drone landing spot and as a place that they can go and wage war, not only in Benghazi and in Derna, as Emad rightly pointed out earlier on, but also those groups that you've labelled as having some sort of success have conducted and had successful ICC investigations labelled against them, which Haftar has muted and has immunized himself from, given this kind of international political power that he has, or the ability to frustrate the international community's efforts on Libya. So I think it's very dangerous for us to look at this, because the deception doesn't just start in Libya, it starts overseas. And I think it's at this moment where they've destroyed the reputation of the United Nations in Libya, which is tasked with not only opening up and creating a roadmap for Libya, but it's tasked with being that honest broker that both sides, or any of the sides that are fighting today in Libya, need to use as a go-between, as an honest broker, to be able to have a diplomacy and dialogue window, to be able to have an open channel of communication between both sides. If the UN's reputation is in tatters, because they see the French diplomatic position is frustrating it and not, labeling their ally in the country, the UAE is violating arms embargo and nothing is happening towards them, then why would you be able to bring them back to the table a year from now or even a month from now? It's going to be almost impossible. So the international support to Haftar is really showing the degree to which multilateralism has failed, and the international system, the diplomatic system, is being broken by two key actors, the UAE and France, who have late been trying to kind of, in a smoke and mirrors attempt, trying to push that over towards Russia and Moscow, to try to create some sort of geopolitical rifts with the Americans. And Haftar is very happy to engage in that. Apparently he's on his way to Moscow now to try to covet some international support, or at least symbolically get the Americans to be worried about this. But the real guilt here and the real power here really lies in two places. Paris and Abu Dhabi have shown themselves to be only willing to work with and back one party, and the solution lies there.
Emad Badi, I want you to talk about the internationally recognised government in Tripoli in 1 second. But first of all, let's hear from the head of that government, Fayez al-Sarraj, and see where he stands, obviously worried about this incursion into Tripoli.
We have extended our hands toward peace, but after the aggression that has taken place on the part of forces belonging to Haftar and his declaration of war against our cities and our capital, he will find nothing but strength and firmness.
Well, Emad Badi, where does that government stand? Is it strong and firm? And the international community, obviously, as Anas was saying, embarrassed. The credibility of the UN is at stake here. And Antonio Guterres was on the ground as this offensive started.
Yeah, well, you have to consider that the Government of National Accord came into Tripoli in 2016 as a result of a political dialogue and the Libyan political agreement, and since then they've attempted to somewhat position themselves at equal distance between two poles, somewhat. The pole of Misrata, which was a revolutionary bastion at a certain point in time, and there were a lot of actors in Misrata that had a conciliatory stance towards Haftar and wanted to have a genuine dialogue with him. And up until a month ago, up until a week ago even, that was still the reality that existed back then. Now, however, as Anas rightly pointed out, trust has been undermined both at the local level but also at the international level. And that's why mediation will be very difficult from here on out. So you've got the actors on the ground, the GNA, that doesn't trust the opposing side at all, because it de facto betrayed them, and it betrayed an agreement that it had initially pointed that it had agreed to a certain extent. And you have Haftar that basically ridiculed the UN by launching his offensive while Guterres was there. And I must say that also the constant appeasement of Haftar during the past 2 years has not contributed to establishing any type of trust as well, because they've always assured the actors, both the GNA and security actors in Misrata, that this type of offensive wouldn't happen. So now they feel betrayed both by Haftar and by the international community at large, and they've somewhat surprisingly gathered under the political somewhat wing or umbrella of the GNA. Right. The question now is, after this, whether Haftar wins or whether the other party manages to thwart his offensive, what the future will be for the GNA because of the slew of people that had no influence over the political process that are now back in the capital and have a firm position within security structures that they don't have really an incentive to leave. And that includes terrorists, that includes internationally sanctioned people, that includes smugglers. But at the same time, all these people see Haftar as a common threat for different reasons.
Okay, Anas al-GhomatI, obviously we're talking about the now, but you don't have to go very far back to realise, what's happened here. Back in 2011, as Muammar Gaddafi was deposed, we had warring sides from both, essentially, east and western Libya, with all different types of militias and forces and outside influence. And, you know, US President Barack Obama back then, you know, as he was leaving office, he kind of admitted to a journalist from Fox News, Chris Wallace, that this was essentially his worst mistake. Let's take a listen.
Probably failing to plan for the day after what I think was the right thing to do in intervening in Libya.
Well, Anas, he's talking about the day after there, but we're, what, 8 years after? How much did the Western-backed intervention, although the US taking a bit of a back step, France, Italy, UK and others obviously very much in the front there, how much did that offensive and then not dealing with the day after lead to us where we are now?
Well, let's not amputate it entirely. It was largely viewed as a success by many Libyans. The first democratic process had an 80% turnout in Libya, and I think in that sense many of the Libyans themselves subscribed to the idea of a transition, a democratic transition at one of that, and one that protected values, and most specifically the one that is relevant today is not a return to military rule, a civilian state that has at its heart the values of social justice, accountability, and the ability to change your mind, which is one of the things that we take for granted across the world almost, but in Libya it was one of those difficult things that you can't change your mind after you've subscribed to one actor, that they just stay as long as they want. So I think in that sense, let's not amputate the history entirely. The difficulty, I think, for Obama was letting go of the neighborhood and letting go and playing honest broker and defining the rules of the game, because for the Arab Spring, what began in 2011 was really not only just, you know, painting the people on the street, whether they're in Tunisia or in Libya or in Syria or in Egypt, as heroes, but the autocrats as villains, and they would only ever be taught as, or only ever be looked at as villains. And I think in the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the military in Egypt have found this to be an existential threat, rightly so, for themselves, and they pushed against. And I think that's, we're kind of in Libya, we're kind of stuck between these two major winds, this democratic wind that was popular with the streets, with many Libyans that came out, and again, in all these different places, the electoral turnout in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya in the first elections were huge. And the enthusiasm and the amount of different candidates that came out and political parties that emerged were huge. Civil society, you know, rose out of the ashes of this old state and came out of nowhere and was an amazing kind of feat in all these different countries. But to describe it as though, well, it was their fault in 2011, you know, almost absolves the guilt from many of those autocratic states that have now kicked out a democratically elected party in Egypt and in Tunisia and have returned them, in, at least in Egypt's case, to full authoritarian rule. And in Tunisia is partially on the way. In Algeria, the UAE has been involved. In Sudan, we're hearing that they're being involved as well. So I think we should also be conscious of the fact that for, you know, this security and stability argument of why things failed, it's not really about human security. It's not really about people's stability. It's about regime security.
Okay. Well,
and it's about making people feel stable outside. So I think we've got to be very careful and not absorbing 350 million people that live in the Arab world and saying, wasn't it better when you couldn't talk about your problems? Wasn't it better when you had no freedom of speech and no freedom of assembly? I think that's the argument that's being made, and that's tosh.
Emad Badi, there is a humanitarian crisis, though, across Libya. Obviously, the effects of this fighting being felt by many people who have been displaced, the refugee situation. What are ordinary citizens on the streets of Tripoli, Benghazi, and elsewhere feeling about the state of their country right now?
I wouldn't be able to speak for the people in Benghazi, but what I hear from my family and friends in Tripoli is that they want the war to stop. Unfortunately, from an international perspective, even though this is indeed turning into a humanitarian crisis and probably a protracted one, I don't see any state that would actively halt it or oppose it. A lot of states will voice their opposition to it. We've seen the EU statement yesterday and Federica Mogherini saying that the escalation should halt and that all armed groups should return to ex-ante positions. However, because this is so existential for Haftar, because this has been 50 years in the making, because if this fails, Haftar will likely not have another shot at power in Libya, at consolidating power and establishing what he envisions, the state he envisions to control in Libya. I don't think this will happen out of the greed of one person, to be honest.
This may sound like a silly question, but are there people in Tripoli, your family, others, who think perhaps Gaddafi and the times under Gaddafi were perhaps better economically, or is it just a question of trying to get the future right in Libya?
Well, it's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, if you're looking at things objectively, obviously the security situation was broadly better. However, in terms of the regime that existed, that wasn't any better than it is now, and I think that's where the conundrum is that we've always had a stateless state to a certain extent that was viewed through a Eurocentric lens, and where Gaddafi was always somewhat of an anchor of stability that held everything together. The assumption after 2011 was that if we reestablished or utilized the state structure that he had and only removed him, that would still function. No one really looked at the structural issues that Libya had, and that's why now automatically this vacuum has to be filled by another person. And I think that for a lot of people the panacea is Haftar, but that doesn't just, it's not a state. You're not technically establishing a state. You're just establishing a repressive regime that cracks down on freedoms, that cracks down on any version of political Islam that it does not agree with, that cracks down on liberties, that utilizes oppression and repression if needed, etc. So that conundrum is a false equation, and I don't think this should be, I think the most important thing that foreign policy should be focused on today is having an anti-authoritarian stance. Unfortunately, because of the US withdrawal that you referred to earlier, that doesn't exist, and Libya has been left out to states like the Gulf, which are essentially authoritarian, and states like France, that is technically backing all the authoritarian states in the Sahel. So it's no wonder that they're backing the same thing in Libya.
Yeah, Anas GomatI, let's just listen to the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, and I'm going to ask you another question off the bat, because I think this is where we're really reaching the nub of the problem.
It is very clear for me that we need to restart a serious political dialogue and a serious political negotiation, but it is obvious that that cannot take place without fully stop of the hostilities.
Anas, you know, the Secretary-General there trying to look forward, but given what Emad said, that there is an absence, especially of the United States, the America First policy in the Middle East seems to be very close to the Egyptian president. He was here at the White House in the last few days, the new Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. In realpolitik terms, does this not look very likely going forward?
Well, unless the UN can deal with the others in the MAGA, making America great again or making authoritarianism great again, if they can't deal with those states, then Libya doesn't stand a chance. I think you have to use your diplomatic levers, you have to use your political levers, and you have to ripen. I mean, if you want to ripen the actors on the ground towards peace, then you have to close all of the enabling doors for war. So the first is the UAE needs to demobilize and leave Al-Khadim Air Base in eastern Libya, which has been using to drone Libyans out of cities in eastern Libya, 100,000 that could have been displaced by, according to some estimates, in Benghazi. 1,700 of those citizens in Dadna now that are in jail, where they were being droned by Emirati and French jets and by unmanned drones. So I think you also have to make sure that those doors that have allowed and enabled Haftar to have this kind of confidence to move forward, that needs to leave. The only things that would most likely alert the internationals to attention is that he's deceptively sold this idea that he's fighting a war on terror, but he hasn't actually given it much notice at all. Many of the groups that we're describing now as Islamists or terrorists were involved in the UN-backed operation against ISIS and completed it in 7.5 months, not the 4 years that it took Benghazi, or rather the 4 years that it took Haftar to attempt to do so in Benghazi with a minimal number of IS fighters and a maximum number of revolutionary fighters that he labeled as IS. So I think you've got a serious problem, because many of those groups now are fighting a very unnecessary war that will open the doors towards ISIS to plug in those gaps when people leave the critical infrastructure, the critical security, day-to-day boring work that isn't really sexy, isn't really that interesting. You know, taking care of your critical infrastructure, your airports, your doors and exits into the country. They're now fighting in main cities and urban warfare and leaving their back turn towards IS. Number two, the humanitarian crisis is spiraling out of control. You've got 10,000 people that have been displaced over the last week, or estimates there around. The WHO has said that it's prepared for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of displaced this morning. Now, if that is the case, it's migration season this month in May.
Yeah.
What happens to the northern Mediterranean, or the southern Mediterranean shores when Libyans start going over there? How do you get a diplomatic handle, political handle, or military handle when you have one or two states that are playing hardball and are paralyzing the international system from condemning the one actor that has provoked this?
Okay, final thoughts, Emad Badi. Do you see that on the horizon, a renewed migration crisis coming from Libya and the result of the renewed violence and the lack of a political solution? Is that what we're looking at over the next few months?
Well, Libyans have always been resilient, despite the fact that the insecurity has definitely risen in the past 9 years. You haven't really fully seen Libya transition into an origin state for migration and not a transit one. However, now you've got to take into account the fact that Haftar has displaced a lot of people from Benghazi. He's displaced a lot of people from Derna. Now he's waging a war on Libya's most populous city, really. It has 2.5 million people. And if this becomes urban warfare, one has to wonder where these people are going to go. Now, whether they'll decide to cross the Mediterranean is a big question. I suspect definitely some of them will, at least the young people that see that as an option will. The others might not, but that doesn't change the fact that this is a humanitarian crisis and people shouldn't just care about it because it will cause arrivals at the northern side of the Mediterranean. People should care about it because it's a humanitarian crisis and people could easily, the international community could easily avert it if it used some coercion, which they don't plan to do, unfortunately. So,
Emad Badi and Anas El-GomatI will have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your insights. It's really been a stimulating, if very worrying, discussion about the future of Libya. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan Keane in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate it.